I currently have two types of brake fluid in my garage. I have this one from Bosch. It's a .5.1 brake fluid, and this is an AMSOIL .3 and 4 brake fluid. So these are totally, completely different, right? The .5.1, .3 and 4? Maybe not as much as you think. You see, you probably don't know enough about brake fluid to make a good decision. Wouldn't you like to know how to make a decision on what brake fluid to use, regardless of which brand and marketing claim that you have on the bottle? We're going to help you understand everything. First, today, we're going to cover issues with brake fluid. Then we're going to get into what types of brake fluid are there, at least a general overview. But then we're going to get into details by going over the car brake fluid specs, because car brake fluid specs gets us into the details and helps us understand how to choose the correct brake fluid. And then we're going to do a brake fluid comparison with some brake fluids that are actually available in my local area and see how they match up with the specs. So what are the issues with brake fluid? First of all, it can boil. And what causes it to boil? It gets hot. If you brake repeatedly and often, the brake fluid gets hot. Now, what causes it to get hotter than normal? Like you might need it more. Towing equipment. If you tow something and say, your vehicle weighs 6,000 pounds, but you're towing a big, huge trailer, and now it weighs 18,000 pounds for the whole system, that's 3 times the weight. You'll have 3 times the energy. You see, the energy of motion is converted to heat through friction with the brakes. And so the more energy into those brakes, and the hotter it gets. So 3 times the weight, 3 times the energy. Speed's an even bigger problem. If you triple the speed, say 25 to 75 miles per hour, and you do a full brake to stop, well, if you look at the kinetic energy equation, the velocity is squared. So the energy would be 9 times as much for 3 times increase in speed. And that's why people that do track days and events like that really need to pay attention to their brake fluid and brake pads and rotors and that type of thing. It really does heat it up. Also, there is a thing called dynamic stability control and traction control. So traction control will brake a wheel so that if one side of the car is slipping, it'll brake that wheel and transfer the torque to the other side of the car. And that braking action, obviously puts heat into the system. A car has dynamic stability control or electronic stability program or electronic stability control. Different automakers call it different things. It's all the same thing. It's basically a system that brakes individual wheels to prevent your car from skidding or spinning. At least it attempts to do that by braking the wheels. So your car will do that, and that does heat up the brake a little bit more than standard car without having any brakes. Well, I say standard car, I mean old car. All modern cars have that stability control system, and so they all activate the brakes at various times, and you might not even be aware of it, and that does heat up the brake fluid. So why is that a problem? Well, boiling, as I said. If the brake fluid boils, it can cause a soft brake pedal. You see, liquid's almost incompressible. So when it's just a nice liquid, the way it's supposed to be in your brake system, and you press on that brake pedal, the pedal is very firm and transfers all that hard press onto those brake pads and really clamps down on those rotors to stop you. But if you get air in the system, in other words, bubbles, like as it's boiling, well, those are compressible because they're just air. And because of that, you'll have a spongy brake pedal. Not the only possible reason for a spongy brake pedal, but you would have a spongy brake pedal if the fluid does boil. And it might be so bad that you can't even stop in an emergency fast enough because you press hard on the brake pedal, but it doesn't put enough pressure on the brake pads to actually cause you to stop the way it should. So boiling brake fluid is an issue. The next issue is contamination. You see, brake fluid is hygroscopic. It absorbs water. So when it absorbs water, and it absorbs water out of the air. Like literally, if it's a humid day, it will absorb water. And some of you might be thinking, oh yeah, but it's sealed in the brake system in the car. It's not completely sealed. There has to be a little bit of an air inlet somewhere, a little hole somewhere to allow air in the system to have it function properly. So it does get air in there and it does absorb water. For that reason, they recommend changing the brake fluid pretty frequently. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The third issue that you have is brake fluid viscosity. Some of you might not even think this is an issue because it just hasn't come up. But you see those traction control systems and dynamic stability control systems and, whatever they're calling them, some of those require very, very small brake fluid passages, really, really narrow tubes that the brake fluid has to go through. And as you know, if you got a really thick fluid, you got some super thick syrup or something and a little tiny hole, it's not going to flow through there. And same with brake fluid. And of course, like a lot of fluids, as you get colder, the brake fluid gets thicker. So in cold climates, especially, it gets really, really thick. And the spec on the table we're going to see is rated at minus 40 degrees Celsius or minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They're the same thing. And that means that it can't be thicker than that spec. But modern brake fluids have to be thinner to make it work with those systems in colder weather. So what types of brake fluid are there? Well, this section, we're just going to do a quick overview. We'll get into the actual brake fluid specs on the table with multiple different types and variations, but let's just do a quick overview. First of all, when I introduced the brake fluids, I called them DOT 5.1 and DOT 3 and 4. DOT stands for Department of Transportation, and that's an organization here in the U.S., the United States Department of Transportation, and they write specs for brake fluid that are required in cars. There's also the International Standards Organization, or ISO, that does exactly the same thing. And there's a whole bunch of others around the world. We'll briefly touch on that at the end. Now, the original modern brake fluid was a DOT 3 brake fluid. It's been around since at least the 1950s, but honestly, in my research, I couldn't find when it was introduced. It was a long time ago. DOT 4 was a higher spec fluid, higher boiling points, and that was a better fluid, and it was compatible with DOT 3. DOT 5 brake fluid is not compatible with DOT 3 and 4. It's silicone-based as opposed to the glycol, ether, or borate esters that the other ones are composed of, and it is not compatible because it's silicone-based. It had a much higher boiling point, which is why they were pushing it, and they wanted everybody to use it, but nobody wanted to use it. The automakers didn't want to spec it in their cars, and people didn't want to use it because they couldn't use it with their old systems, so it just kind of died on the vine. It did have advantages. Some older cars did require a DOT 5 silicone brake fluid. The U.S. military uses it for reasons, and it's not compatible with modern cars. It's not compatible with ABS systems or those stability control and traction control systems. Not compatible with any of those things, so you can't use it in modern cars. Because of that, it's colored purple. So if you see purple brake fluid, that is a silicone brake fluid. Do not use it in your car. It's not compatible. The regular brake fluid, the DOT 3 and DOT 4, they are clear or amber colored, so it's very easy to spot them. Then there's a DOT 5.1 brake fluid. Okay, now could they have just called it a DOT 6? I mean, seriously, please. But anyway, it's called a DOT 5.1 brake fluid. That has the advantages of the silicone brake fluid with the high boiling points, but it is compatible with the DOT 3 and 4 fluids. Now, let's get into the car brake fluid specs in detail. First of all, if you look at the DOT 3 brake fluid on the table, you can see it has a fairly high dry and wet boiling points, but notice how low that wet boiling point is compared to the dry boiling point. The dry boiling point would basically be only when it's brand new, and that wet thing, the 3.7% water, that's supposed to represent what it is after 1 year in your system. Now, DOT 3 fluid, they recommend changing every year. DOT 4 fluid, they recommend every 2 years. And they probably recommend the same thing with the DOT 5.1 fluid, although you might be able to get by with 3 years with the DOT 5.1 fluid. I'd probably still change it after 2 years because I just can't let it go. I'm kind of persnickety about that and need to change my stuff on a regular basis to be comfortable. Now, DOT 3 fluid has a very high viscosity, 1,500 millimeters squared per second. And we're not going to really talk about the units. We'll just talk about the number, 1,500. So it has high viscosity. Now, the other viscosity one is the viscosity at the boiling point of water. And we really don't care about that because it's a very easy spec to meet. And it's a minimum spec, and all of the brake fluids will meet that spec very easily, so we'll just ignore that one. And then the chemistry, I have there glycol, ether, and later on we'll see borate esters in there. DOT3 fluid can contain the borate ester. There's no requirement that it can't contain that. It's just traditionally the older fluids didn't have that, and the spec was written for just the glycol ether, but it didn't eliminate the possibility of having a borate ester in there. All the other brake fluids have a combination of glycol ether, borate ester, or whatever. I'm not sure on the chemistry, but we're not going to really care about that either. Now, the DOT4 brake fluid increased the dry and wet boiling points, and the DOT4 spec increased the viscosity a little bit, but the corresponding ISO 4925 class 4 spec actually kept the same viscosity as the DOT3 spec. So it's just a little bit different on the DOT and ISO specs in this one. The next one is the Super DOT4 brake fluid. Now, this is not an official spec. It's a marketing claim or a marketing, moniker. And it basically just increased the temperature rating, the dry and wet boiling point, and kept the DOT3 viscosity. So it's a marketing claim. I call it a racing brake fluid because it's kind of what you would use on the track in a lot of cases, or you'd use even higher temperature, but this is the kind of spec you'd use on the track a lot of times. Next is DOT4 LV for low viscosity, also called DOT4 Plus. Now this again is a marketing claim. It's a thing dreamed up by some of the automakers because they needed a low viscosity brake fluid. There was no spec, and it seems like the regulators are slower than molasses to get these standards out. So anyway, they called it DOT4 LV, and it has the temperature ratings of a regular DOT4 brake fluid, but it has a very low viscosity of 750. Next is often called a DOT4 class 6 fluid, but again, that's not really an official designation, but it is referring to an official designation, which is the ISO 4925 class 6 standard. And it has a much higher dry and wet boiling point, but it keeps the low viscosity of the low viscosity fluid, 750. So that's a nice fluid. Then we get on to the DOT 5.1 fluid, also ISO class 5-1, because, we have to confuse everybody about it. But it has an even higher dry and wet boiling points. And you might think it's surprising that it actually has a higher viscosity than the other fluids that we just looked at. That's probably because it was created long before those standards were created. That's why that's called a class 6 on the ISO chart, because it was created after the DOT 5.1 fluid. I think they thought 900 millimeters squared per second was sufficient, but automakers have decided that 750 is a better number, and so that's the newer standard. So somebody was actually thinking about this and came up with the DOT 5.1 ESP, or, okay, that's not an official designation. It's really ISO 4925 class 7 brake fluid. Thankfully, the people at ISO are actually up to spec and on the ball, and they came up with this spec. It has the same high temperature ratings of the DOT 5.1 fluid with the low viscosity of the ISO 4925 class 6 brake fluid. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Now for a bit of brake fluid comparison. Let's start out with these two Motul fluids that I've used before on the track. We've got the Motul RBF 600 and RBF 660. So let's take a look at the specs on the chart. If you look, they qualify well above the Super DOT4 high temperature fluid, so very high temperature fluid, but the viscosity is also extremely high. It's as high as the old DOT4 standard. Next, this Prestone fluid is available in all my local shops. It's very popular, apparently, with the shops in my area. So the Prestone fluid, there's a DOT4 and a DOT 5.1 that I have listed here. And the only specs they give on the website is that the temperature is a bit higher than the standard spec for each one. That's why I put the other specs in brackets, because it's just copying the standard specs, because they don't give us anything other than the dry temperature, the dry boiling point, which isn't all that important because in regular road cars, the dry boiling point only lasts for maybe, 6 months, 5 months, 3 months, whatever. And then you're into more of the wet boiling point thing. So dry boiling point isn't all that interesting for most road cars. But that's all the spec they give. Interestingly, they say that the DOT4 fluid is good for 75,000 miles, which is crazy. What if I put 5,000 miles on my car per year? That means I can go 15 years without changing my fluid. Or maybe I buy a collector car and I put this stuff in there and I only drive the collector car 1,000 miles a year. Oh, okay, so I can keep it in there for 75 years. Yeah, no, I don't think so. That would be kind of crazy. And the .5 fluid, they just say extreme braking. Yeah, that doesn't tell you anything. So I don't like it when manufacturers don't list the entire specs for the fluid. In fact, I think regulators, it should require that brake fluid that's sold aftermarket should be required to list all the relevant specs. The other thing to note about the Prestone fluids is that they're radically different in price. If you take a look, they look the same price, but the sizes are different. So if we calculate the price per quart, quart's approximately equal to a liter for those of you that aren't in the United States. So you could say price per liter. The DOT 5.1 brake fluid is like, what, $45 a quart? I mean, that is just really expensive. So yeah, huge difference in price with the Prestone fluids there. Here's an interesting one. This Liquimoly brand has two .4 fluids. I found this on a website for one of the auto parts stores that's in my area, and both lists as .4, and honestly, if I just look at this, they look almost exactly the same. One's just a little more expensive than the other. But if you look carefully, there is a difference in part numbers, and if you look at the individual bottles, you'll see that one is just regular .4, and one says SL6.4, and that's your clue as what the difference is. The regular .4 Liquimoly is, the .4 spec, or the ISO 4925 class 4. It does meet that spec as well. But the SL6.4 meets the ISO 4925 class 6 spec. So it's a much lower viscosity brake fluid and a much better brake fluid. I would buy that one instead of the other one because they're nearly the same price. Now, let's get back to this Bosch fluid that I introduced at the beginning. This is an ESI 6 fluid, that's their name for it, and it's a .5.1 fluid. Or is it? Well, if you look at the specs on the sheet, you can see that it actually qualifies under the ISO 4925 Class 7 fluid. This is a very high spec fluid, and it's not very expensive. I looked on two different sites, the Amazon and one of my local auto parts stores, and both sell the Bosch fluid for $19.99 per quart, or approximately a liter. So very cheap, much cheaper than that Prestone that doesn't even give you the specs. So yeah, that's a better deal, isn't it? And yeah, it does actually say ISO 4925 Class 7 on the bottle for the Bosch fluid. So if you knew what you were looking at, that would make sense. Now you do know what you're looking at. Now, what about that AMSOIL fluid? This stuff that says .3 and 4. What about that? Why am I making a big point about this? Well, let's put it on the chart. You can see that it actually qualifies as a .5.1 brake fluid. It has very high temperature ratings, very high, and it has a pretty low viscosity. In fact, if they had just lowered the viscosity just a little bit more, they could get it to qualify as ISO 4925 Class 7. And perhaps they'll do that in the future with that fluid. But that fluid's not very expensive either. I figured out on the AMSOIL website, with no discounts at all, because there's ways to get discounts on AMSOIL, it's $26 per quart. So again, not terribly expensive, and certainly cheaper than that Prestone .5.1 fluid that we saw earlier. So maybe now you have enough information to decide for yourself. Keep in mind that you can always choose a brake fluid that has a higher wet and dry boiling point and a lower viscosity than what came with your car originally. Let's look at some international standards. This is just a smattering that I found, and I didn't find very much information on them, and partly because, well, I don't speak the languages, and some of these are really difficult to find. But you can see there's a few other specs around the world, and I'm sure there's lots more. You might have to match up some of the things in your country with the specs that I've listed on the chart here to understand which fluid would be best for you. Now, what would I like to see in the future? Well, honestly, with modern technology and chemistry that seems to be out there, there honestly is just no reason to have this many brake fluids. It's very confusing. I think you guys were confused before we did this video, and maybe you're still confused. So what I think we should do is have a .4R fluid. That's my name for it, .4R. And that would be very high dry and wet boiling points, and we could let it have very high viscosity because we don't really care. It's kind of a racing brake fluid. That's the R, of course. Or, you could go the motorcycle way and call it RR or RRR. Be a pirate fluid. RR. Anyway, okay, I'm getting bad with the jokes. But anyway, the .4R fluid. The other fluid that you need, the ISO 4925 Class 7 fluid. And hey, U.S. Department of Transportation, yeah, I'm calling you out. Let's just call that a .7 fluid, please. Come on, get your act together and just call that a .7. And if you're worried about, oh my gosh, we got to call it a .6 because we don't have a .6. Well, put the ISO 4925 Class 6 fluid as a .6 fluid. I mean, seriously, it's not that hard to do. Okay, but call this a .7 fluid, and then change the regulations over time within, maybe a 5 or 10 year period, and make it so that all modern cars have to have a .7 fluid as a spec, and just get rid of all those other fluids. And no, it's not going to be more expensive. It's already, $20 a quart for the Bosch stuff. You can get that fluid cheap. And in fact, once the production ramps up, if you get everybody to agree that that's the fluid we're all going to use, then there's going to be a whole bunch of automakers that can do it, and a whole bunch of chemical producers, and we're going to have very inexpensive brake fluids. Everyone will compete, the production costs will go down, and it will be a very inexpensive fluid. So that's my thing for what we should do in the future. And if you have any regulators in your country or have any access to any regulators, please pass them this video and let them understand that, hey, the consumer is confused and they need the simplicity. .4R, high boiling point, thick fluid. .7 fluid, somewhat lower boiling point, but still plenty high, but low viscosity for modern vehicles. I hope you learned something today. Please like, subscribe, and write down what brake fluid do you have in your car right now? Do you even know? And what kind of brake fluids are in your country that might be good brake fluids? I like to hear from you.